Greetings all. Today is quite a simple one as I put together a Slaanesh flavoured squad leader for my Chaos Space Marines, using some simple arm and head swaps from the Age of Sigmar Myrmidesh Painbringers kit. Now there's nothing too in-depth with this one, so I'm starting with using the bodies from my Start Collecting Chaos Space Marines set. With this, there is some more work that needs to be done to make the Myrmidesh arms fit, as the models in the Start Collecting box are very monopose. For this one here, I'm going to use the Aspiring Champion from the kit, armed with the chain axe. Now normally in his left arm he would be brandishing a plasma pistol, but I'm going to be changing that, so the first thing I want to do is put a handle onto this holster here, freeing up his hand for something else. To do this, I'm going to be taking a spare holster from my bits box with a handle attached, and carefully removing the handle with my knife. Any old handle would do here, as they're all roughly the same size, and looking at the size of the tiny Chaos holster, I don't think scale matters too much here. With the handle removed, it can be trimmed to size and glued in place on his empty holster. I'll also use my clippers to remove the nub on the left arm connection, as we won't be needing that one. After this has been done, I can move on to that left hand, and to keep it simple, I'm going to use this clawed hand here, removing part of the cloth decoration with my clippers, before flattening the join area a little with my knife, as the original models have a ball and socket style fit, before bringing it onto the model with some plastic glue. Now, I can either have this arm as just decorative, or run it as a proxy for a lightning claw maybe, though it is rather small for that. Either way, it looks very Slaanesh. Scale-wise isn't too different from the size of a normal Space Marine arm, and in artwork for the Emperor's Children they have a habit of removing sections of armour for body modifications, so that fits quite nicely too. His shoulder pads, I'm going to use this one that I had 3D printed a while ago. The multi-part Chaos Marine kit comes with a few shoulders to use, but sadly the Start Collecting ones do not. But this 3D printed one is quite nice and has a Chaos design on it, so with a little super glue to attach the resin to the plastic, and the shoulder is in place. And now for the head of this Aspiring Champion. Again from the Myrmidesh kit, I have this one with a really long tongue. It is going to have a slight adjustment however, as a combination of a top knot and tongue aren't going to fit into the space on the Chaos Space Marine body. So taking my clippers and knife, I snipped away the hairpiece and flattened the area out. With that done, the head can be glued in place. Because of the tongue and the shape of the armour, it had to be pointing upwards, but I felt that the pose of the model worked quite well for this. Some of the Chaos bodies don't have the same neck armour, so it would fit better, but this one did. And with that, the Kitbash part is done. Very quick and simple one here. And here he is, painted up in the grey of... I kid. As this was going to be such a short one, I thought I would try my hand at painting him on camera. So, to begin with, I primed him all over with Citadel's Grey Sear Primer. Now for the paint scheme I'm going with, it would have been easier with a black primer, but I have run out of that, so starting from grey. The next step would be to take some black. I'm using a Baden Black from Games Workshop for this, thinning it out with a little water, and giving the whole miniature a couple of thin coats, so as not to lose any detail but still get a good coverage. With the whole thing now black, I'm going to take a pink, in this case Citadel's Pink Horror, and begin to block in the areas I think should be pink. I'm doing the bottom of the legs, the shoulder pads, one hand, and the vents and some other parts on the backpack, and most of the torso. Again, to get a decent coverage over the black, I used a couple of coats. If any mistakes are made during this stage, they can be easily fixed up later on using black still on the palette, so won't have to worry too much about that. Now the next step, which I probably should have done before adding the pink, is I'm going to take some grey paint, in this case Citadel's Celestra Grey, and using a large older brush, I'm going to dry brush over the black areas to do some basic edge highlighting. With that dry brushing step done, I'm going to move on to some gold trim, and I'm using Citadel's Retributor armour for this. Now, generally speaking, the Emperor's Children have black trim on their armour, and I'm going to go with that for the most part around the pink sections, but I do like to add some gold around the black plates to give it some definition. As well as around some of the trim, I'm going to add gold to the skull on his leg, the dangly skulls on his loincloth, the claws around the backpack vents, the symbols on his shoulders, some bits on the belt, and the fingers of his clawed hand. I find it can be useful to have another brush at hand during this process, in case any mistakes are made. If you get paint in the wrong place, you can very quickly take this brush, get it rather wet, and go over the area of the mistake. If the paint has not had time to dry, it will easily come off with just a watered down brushing. With the trim done, I moved on to a brown to do the leather areas on the model. I'm using Mornfang Brown for this, as that's what I have, and I'm going to coat the loincloth, the holster, the belt pouches, the handle of his axe, and the left glove with this, taking care not to get it on any of the gold. Though again, this can be easily fixed with paints already on the palette. After that brown, I'm going to move on to the exposed skin of his face and his elbow, and I'm going to be using Rakarth Flesh as a base for this. Once the skin is base coated, I'm going to move on to the metal areas of the miniature, and these are getting done with some Runefang steel. Now I personally don't like this paint very much, but I couldn't find an alternative as I wanted to use a bright steel colour for this base coat, as it will be dulled down quite a bit later on. This is going on the pipes on his chest, the teeth of the axe, the exhaust on his power pack, the grenade, the chain on his belt, and the base of the horn on his head. With that done, I moved on to tidying up the black trim and any other areas that needed it, whilst waiting on the skin colours to fully dry. And once they are, I'm going to use some Guilliman Flesh contrast paint to cover the whole area of skin. This will run into the recesses like a wash, but it will stain some of the higher areas, giving it a more fleshy look. After the skin has dried again, I came in with some of the pink horror on his tongue and a little of the Rakarth Flesh for the horn spouting from his head, before moving on to the cloth hanging from his left shoulder. This I'm going to base in the flesh colour, as I'm going to be using a purple for it, and I wanted to have a lighter base colour to start from. And once this base coat on the cloth has dried, I could move on to adding some purple. I'm going to be using Phoenician purple, and I'm going to give it a couple of thinned out coats to really cover it nicely. Again, letting this dry completely, I'm moving on to highlighting that cloth area with some Genestealer purple. This time using a much smaller brush, as I'm going to highlight the edges with a sideways motion, making little lines all the way along the edge, and some on the raised areas of the cloth folds. I find this helps to suggest the texture of cloth, as opposed to doing smooth highlights. And that is all of the base colours, some details and a little highlighting done. The next step I'm going to do is give the model an all-over coat of a matte varnish, as I'm going to be using an oil wash, and you don't want to be doing that on unvarnished paint. Now, to make my oil wash, I'm going to be using a mauve and a black oil paint. I'm pretty sure it can be any oil paint you can get your hands on. These two I found in a box in the garage, and are probably 1,000 years old. And some turpentine will be needed, or other oil paint thinner. I'm going to take a little of each colour and add some of the thinner, mixing it together well. I'm looking for the consistency of a contrast paint or a really heavy wash paint. And once this is mixed up, I shall be using an old paintbrush to cover the entire model. You don't really want to be using one of your best paintbrushes for this, because it's not going to come out quite so easy. Now, if you're not familiar with oil washes, this can look quite severe, covering the whole miniature that I just spent quite a while painting up. But the beauty of the oil wash is that it can be easily removed, and that is what I'm actually relying on to get the effect that I desire. With the whole miniature covered, this will need to be set aside to dry, and oil takes a lot longer to dry than acrylic paint, so I took the opportunity to take a break and get a cup of tea. Another note is that this will smell quite a lot, so maybe do it outside, or make sure to have good ventilation if you're doing it inside. Once that oil wash is dried up, we can now begin to take off what we don't need. Using some turpentine and a cotton bud, I'm just going to wipe away what I don't want, gently leaving the wash in the recesses and some of the lower points on the miniature. And once the desired result has been achieved, this once again has to be left to dry before putting the varnish on again to seal that wash in. At this point I would probably use a matte varnish unless you want a shiny model at the end of it all. Now, as a note, you can use normal washes for this step, but since I discovered that oil washes aren't quite as scary as I thought them to be, I found I prefer this technique, as regular washes can leave tide marks and stain some of the higher areas and generally take a lot more work to get the result I wanted. Now some final touches need to be done. I'm using some Vallejo off-white and a small brush for the eyes and the big eye on his belt. As the last step was a varnish, if you do happen to make a mistake here, you can easily use the wet brush technique to quickly erase and start again, which I had to do a couple of times on these eyeballs. I'm definitely not perfect. Now with the white on and drying, I used a tiny bit of gold to do the studs on his tongue, before turning to some black to finish off with a little dot in the centre of his eyes. You kind of want to do more of a little line than a dot here, as if you have just a tiny dot in the middle with white all around it, he's going to look very, very surprised. I will now be taking some Tesseract Glow to finish off the eye on his belt. I toyed with maybe doing this a yellow or an orange to start with, but in the name of speed I decided to go with this glowy green instead. I generally like the effect that it gives. The temptation was also to do his eyes the same, but I held back as that could be a little bit overpowering. The final steps on this would be to do his base. I'm going to go simple on this and use some snakebite leather contrast paint on the dirt texture and some of the Celestra grey from earlier on the rock. Once the tactical rock has dried enough, it can then be washed with some Agrex Earthshade, and the rim of the base can have a few coats of Abaddon Black just to finish it off. And here we have my Chaos Space Marine of the Emperor's Children Legion. The Kitbash was rather simple but effective, and my painting skills may not be the best in the world, but I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. If you did, then feel free to let me know in the comments below by hitting the like button and subscribing if you've not done so already. With that, I would like to say a big thank you for watching, and a special thanks to anyone who subscribed over the last year. I started out with a goal of hitting 100 by the end of the year, so I kind of smashed that one, and I look forward to seeing where the numbers are at the end of this year. Anyways, stay safe and have a good one all.